My body belongs to me. You don't get to dictate anything. My name's Derek Langston. I'm 33, a third-grade teacher at Westfield Elementary in Kansas City, Missouri for 8 years now. When my wife Madison spoke those words, we'd been married for exactly 5 weeks and 2 days. In all that time, she hadn't let me near her. Not a kiss lasting more than a moment. Not holding hands while watching TV. Nothing. I sat on our couch, the same brown leather one I'd purchased 3 years ago when I thought I'd be single forever, trying to make sense of her words. We'd dated for 14 months. We discussed everything. We'd been close before the wedding. We'd even lived together for 6 months prior to getting married. But the instant we exchanged vows at St. Catherine's Chapel, something shifted. Madison, I'm not dictating anything. I'm just asking why you won't even kiss me goodnight. She turned back to her phone, swiping through something I couldn't see. I told you my body, my choice. That phrase had become her go-to response lately. When I asked if we could share the bed instead of her sleeping in the guest room. When I tried to hold her hand during dinner with my parents last Sunday. When I suggested a weekend getaway to mark our first month as a married couple. I respect that completely, I said, but we're married, I thought. You thought wrong. She didn't even glance up. I went to the kitchen and fixed myself a sandwich. Turkey and Swiss on wheat, the same thing I'd eaten for lunch at school since September. As I chewed, something that had been nagging me for weeks came into focus. Back in March, during a premarital counseling session with Pastor Williams, Madison had said something that stuck with me. She'd mentioned that marriage was about stability and partnership, not just physical connection. At the time, I thought she meant we had a bond deeper than mere attraction. Now, staring at an empty mayonnaise jar I'd forgotten to replace, I wondered if I'd overlooked something critical. The woman in our living room felt like a stranger. The Madison I'd dated would snuggle up during movies. She'd laugh at my awful jokes about fractions and long division. She'd wake up early on Saturdays to make coffee and sit with me while I graded assignments. This Madison treated me like a barely tolerated housemate. And something in her tone when she said, "You thought wrong," made me think this wasn't temporary. This was her intention all along. I met Madison at a teacher's conference in October 2 years ago. She was a social worker for the school district, handling complex family cases that teachers like me couldn't manage alone. She was reserved, thoughtful, and had a way of listening that made you feel truly heard. When she smiled, which was rare, it felt like a reward. Our first date was coffee at a downtown shop. We talked for 3 hours about everything but work. She shared stories of growing up in a small Illinois town, how her parents split when she was 12, and how she'd learned early that people weren't always what they appeared to be. I told her about losing my dad in college, how teaching pulled me out of a dark place, and how I'd nearly given up on finding someone who understood that my job was more than just a paycheck. For that first year, everything felt perfect. She'd attend school events and chat easily with other teachers. My mom adored her instantly, which was notable since my mom had opinions about every woman I'd ever dated. Madison seemed to fit into my life effortlessly, but looking back, I see the signs I ignored. She avoided discussing the future beyond vague comments about creating something stable together. When we moved in together last summer, she insisted on separate bank accounts and splitting all expenses evenly, even though I earned more and offered to cover more costs. During our engagement, she focused more on wedding details than on our life as a married couple. She spent hours researching venues and flowers, but dodged conversations about honeymoon plans or long-term living arrangements. When I mentioned starting a family in a few years, she'd just nod and say, "We'll see." The biggest warning sign came during our final counseling session in August. Pastor Williams asked what we were most excited about in marriage. I spoke about building a family and growing old together. Madison said she looked forward to a stable foundation to grow from. When he asked her to elaborate, she talked about how marriage would give her security to focus on her career ambitions. At the time, I thought she was being practical. Madison had always been more reserved, more cautious with her words. I assumed she was nervous about making big emotional declarations in front of someone she barely knew. Now, watching her scroll through her phone like I wasn't even there, I realized it wasn't nerves. It was honesty. She'd married me for stability, not love. And the physical closeness we'd shared during our relationship, that was just an act to seal the deal. The tipping point came on a Tuesday night in November. I'd made dinner, we ate in silence, and she went straight to the guest room to read. I sat in the living room, staring at the wall where we'd hung our wedding photos 6 weeks earlier, trying to figure out my next step. Then I remembered something. During our counseling sessions, Pastor Williams had recorded our discussions for his notes. He'd asked for permission, explaining that he sometimes reviewed them to better assist couples. Madison had agreed, and we'd both signed forms allowing the recordings. The next morning, during my lunch break, I called Pastor Williams. "Derek, good to hear from you. How are you and Madison adjusting to married life?" "That's why I'm calling. I need to ask about those recordings from our sessions." There was a pause. "Is everything okay?" "I think Madison was dishonest about her intentions during counseling. I need to know if those recordings still exist." Pastor Williams was silent for a moment. "Son, that's a serious claim." "What makes you think?" "She told me last night she never planned to have a physical relationship with me after marriage. She said she married me for security, not love." "Oh, Derek," his voice softened. "Yes, I still have the recordings. They're kept for 6 months after counseling ends. If you're considering legal action, you should know you both consented to the recordings, so they could potentially be used as evidence." That evening, I sat in our driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Madison was in the kitchen warming up leftover soup. "Madison, we need to talk." She didn't look up from the stove. "About what?" "About what you said during our premarital counseling. About marriage being about security, not physical closeness." She turned then, giving me her full attention for the first time in weeks. "What about it?" "Pastor Williams recorded those sessions. You said things that contradict what you're telling me now." Her face paled. "You wouldn't." "Wouldn't what?" "You wouldn't use those against me. That's private." I looked at the woman I thought I knew, the one I'd vowed to love and honor, and realized she was a stranger. "Madison, did you ever intend to have a real marriage with me?" She set down her spoon and crossed her arms. "I gave you what I promised, a wife, a partnership. If you expected more, that's on you." I nodded slowly. Okay, what? Okay, I understand now." I went to our bedroom, opened my laptop, and began researching annulment procedures in Missouri. If Madison wanted a business arrangement, she'd learned that such arrangements could be undone when one party committed fraud. I filed for annulment on a Friday morning in December. The grounds were fraud and misrepresentation. Missouri law permits annulment when one spouse hides critical facts that would have prevented the marriage. I handed Madison the papers that evening when she got home from work. She read them twice, then looked at me with something I'd never seen before, fury. "You're actually doing this over sex?" "This isn't about sex, Madison. This is about honesty. You lied about what kind of marriage you wanted." She tossed the papers on the kitchen counter. "I never lied. I told you I valued stability and partnership. You told Pastor Williams physical intimacy wasn't important to you in marriage. You said you married me because I was safe and stable, not because you loved me. You said that in July." Her face went pale. "Those sessions were supposed to be confidential." "They were. Until you broke our marriage vows 5 weeks after we made them." Madison spent the weekend on the phone with someone. I could hear her voice through the guest room door but couldn't make out the words. On Monday morning, she was waiting in the kitchen with coffee and toast. The first time she'd made breakfast since our honeymoon. "Derek, I think we started off wrong. Marriage takes adjustment. Maybe we can work through this." I looked at the woman who'd refused to touch me for over a month, now suddenly eager to reconcile once legal papers were involved. "What changed your mind?" "I realized I might have been too harsh. Physical intimacy matters in marriage. We can figure it out." "Figure it out how?" She stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. "However you want." I was just scared, you know. Marriage is a big step. For a moment, I almost believed her. This was the Madison I dated, the one who'd convinced me she cared about more than stability. But then I recalled her words from Tuesday night. "If you expected more, that's on you." "Madison, why the sudden change?" "I'm not changing anything. I'm trying to save our marriage." "No," I said, gently moving her hand off my arm. "You're trying to avoid the legal consequences of fraud." Her expression hardened. "Fine, you want to play hardball. My lawyer says you'll never prove fraud. It's your word against mine, and I'll testify you're lying about those recordings." "Your lawyer?" "I hired one over the weekend. He says this is just you being spiteful because you can't handle rejection. He says the court will see this as a man punishing his wife for asserting her bodily autonomy." I nodded slowly. Okay, what?" "Okay, I understand your strategy. You're going to paint me as controlling and abusive." Madison smiled for the first time in months, but it wasn't the smile I'd fallen for. "The truth is the truth, Derek. You filed for annulment because I wouldn't sleep with you. How do you think that'll look?" That evening, I called my attorney, Janet Morris, who'd handled my dad's estate 5 years earlier. I explained everything and asked her to review the annulment petition. Derek, you need to understand something. Annulment cases are tough to prove, especially if the other party fights it. Are you certain you have evidence? I have recordings of her admitting she married me for financial security, not love. She explicitly said physical intimacy wasn't part of her marriage expectations. And you have legal access to these recordings? Yes, we both consented to them, and Pastor Williams confirmed they can be used as evidence. Janet paused. In that case, your case might be stronger than her attorney realizes. The next morning, I drove to Pastor Williams' office to collect copies of our counseling session recordings. He greeted me with a somber look and a manila envelope. Derek, I've prayed about this. I believe these recordings will reveal the truth, but I'm sorry it's come to this. What do you mean? He handed me the envelope. I reviewed the sessions after your call. Things Madison said didn't fully register at the time, but they make sense now. That evening, I sat in my empty classroom and listened to 6 hours of recorded sessions. What I heard reshaped everything I thought I knew about my wife. In the third session, from June, Pastor Williams asked Madison about her past relationships. She said she'd dated several men, but they all demanded too much emotionally. She preferred relationships where she could stay independent and focus on her career. When Pastor Williams asked what she wanted in a husband, Madison's response was chilling. Someone stable who won't make emotional demands. Someone who will provide security without expecting me to be something I'm not. Pastor Williams asked if she understood that marriage typically involves emotional and physical closeness. Madison replied, I think Derek will be fine with companionship and partnership. He's not the type to push for things I'm uncomfortable with. In the fifth session, the conversation grew even more revealing. Pastor Williams asked what we expected from marriage regarding intimacy and family planning. I spoke about wanting kids and building a life together. Madison said she saw marriage as a practical arrangement between two adults who respect each other's boundaries. When Pastor Williams asked about those boundaries, Madison said, I need someone who understands I'm not a physically affectionate person. I can be a good wife in terms of partnership and household duties, but I don't want to be forced into romantic expectations that don't come naturally. The pastor asked if she discussed this with me. Madison said, Derek seems to get that I'm more reserved than other women. I think he'll adjust. But the most incriminating recording was from our final session in August. Pastor Williams asked if we had concerns about the upcoming marriage. I said I was thrilled about everything. Madison said she was relieved to have the security of marriage and was confident Derek would respect her need for space and independence. When the pastor asked what she meant by space, Madison explained she planned to maintain separate sleeping arrangements after marriage and hoped I'd understand that physical intimacy wasn't a priority for her. Pastor Williams asked if she discussed this with me. Madison said, Not directly, but I've given him hints. If he hasn't picked up on them, we'll deal with it after the wedding. I stopped the recording and sat in the dark classroom for an hour. Madison hadn't just lied about her intentions. She'd orchestrated the deception from the start. She'd banked on me being too kind, too accommodating, too desperate for companionship to demand honesty about what our marriage would entail. The woman I'd married never intended to be a true wife. She'd wanted a roommate to share expenses and provide social legitimacy while giving nothing in return. But she'd made a critical error. She'd been candid with Pastor Williams, likely assuming those conversations would stay buried. I spent the weekend organizing evidence and preparing for the legal fight ahead. On Monday, I met with Janet Morris to review the recordings. She listened to key sections, taking notes and occasionally shaking her head. When we finished, she leaned back and looked at me with near disbelief. Derek, in 20 years of family law, I've never seen such clear evidence of premarital fraud. Your wife admitted to deliberate deception multiple times. What does that mean for the annulment? It means we're not just going to win, we're going to win convincingly. Missouri courts take marriage fraud seriously, especially with documented proof of intentional deceit. Janet outlined the next steps. We'd file a motion to include the recordings as evidence, along with a detailed timeline of Madison's deceptive actions. We'd also request that Madison cover all legal costs and return any gifts or benefits she'd gained from the fraudulent marriage. One more thing, Janet said. If Madison's attorney tries to claim this is about sexual coercion or abuse, these recordings will dismantle that narrative. She repeatedly states she never intended a physical relationship and married you because she thought you wouldn't demand one. That evening, Madison was waiting when I got home. She'd cooked dinner and set the table with our wedding china, something she'd never done since we'd been married. "Derek, I've been reflecting on what you said. Maybe we can try counseling together and sort this out." I settled across from her and surveyed the lavish dinner she'd prepared. Pot roast with roasted vegetables, fresh-baked bread, and apple pie for dessert. "Madison, when did you find time to make all this?" "I took the afternoon off work. I wanted to prove I'm serious about repairing our marriage. By putting in effort, by showing you I value this relationship." I took a bite of the pot roast. It was exceptional, likely the finest meal she'd ever cooked. "This is really good." She smiled, and for a brief moment she seemed genuinely pleased. "I'm glad you think so. I thought we could start fresh. Leave all this legal mess behind and work on building something real." "Madison, why now? Why didn't you want to build something real 2 months ago?" Her smile wavered slightly. "I told you I was scared. Marriage is a huge adjustment." "No," I said softly. "You weren't scared. You got exactly what you wanted, a husband to split the bills and leave you alone." "That's not true." I pulled out my phone and played a 30-second clip from one of our counseling sessions. Madison's voice echoed in the dining room. "I need someone who knows I'm not a physically affectionate person. I can be a good wife in terms of partnership and managing the household, but I don't want to be forced into romantic expectations that don't come naturally to me." Madison's face drained of color. She stood so abruptly her chair toppled over. "You can't use those. Those were private discussions. Those were discussions where you admitted to orchestrating exactly what you've done to our marriage. Derek, please, we can sort this out. I'll do whatever you want." I looked at this woman who'd spent 2 months refusing any physical contact, now offering to do anything because her lies had been exposed. "Madison, what I want is an honest marriage, and you've already shown you can't provide that." The court hearing occurred on a chilly January morning. Madison arrived with her lawyer, a sharply dressed man who exuded confidence despite the evidence against his client. Janet had cautioned me that Madison's attorney would likely claim I was emotionally manipulative or sexually demanding, portraying me as a domineering husband unable to respect his wife's boundaries. Judge Patricia Henderson called the session to order and requested both sides to present their cases. Madison's lawyer went first, delivering the defense Janet had anticipated. "Your Honor, this case sets a dangerous precedent. Mr. Langston is attempting to penalize his wife for exercising her fundamental right to bodily autonomy. The annulment petition is merely retribution for her refusal to comply with his sexual expectations." The attorney depicted Madison as a victim of marital pressure, asserting she'd been coerced into reconsidering physical intimacy after marriage. He argued that no wife should face legal repercussions for refusing her husband. Then Janet rose. "Your Honor, I'd like to present audio evidence that directly refutes the defense's portrayal of this case." She played selected clips from our counseling sessions, including Madison's statements about marrying me for stability, her admission that she never intended to share physical intimacy in our marriage, and her acknowledgement that she'd sent me hints about her intentions without being upfront. The courtroom fell silent as Madison's voice filled the room, calmly outlining her plan to mislead me about the core nature of our marriage. Judge Henderson requested to hear the recordings again, then fixed her gaze on Madison. "Mrs. Langston, these recordings indicate that you entered this marriage with no intention of fulfilling basic marital responsibilities, and that you intentionally hid this from your husband. Do you dispute the authenticity of these recordings?" Madison's lawyer whispered something to her, but she shook her head. "No, Your Honor, but I was just being truthful about my feelings. Truthful with Pastor Williams, but not with your husband." Madison had no response. Judge Henderson granted the annulment without delay. She ruled that Madison had committed fraud by concealing her true intentions about the marriage, and her deception provided sufficient grounds to void the marriage contract entirely. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I'm ordering Mrs. Langston to return all gifts received in connection with this marriage and to cover all court costs and attorney fees. Marriage is a legal contract rooted in mutual trust and good faith. When one party deliberately deceives the other about essential aspects of that contract, they bear the consequences." Madison's face collapsed as the reality sank in. Not only was our marriage annulled, but she would have to return thousands of dollars in wedding gifts and pay over $10,000 in legal fees. As we exited the courthouse, Madison made one final attempt to speak to me. "Derek, I'm sorry, I never meant for things to go this far." I looked at her, knowing it would be the last time. "Madison, you meant for it to go exactly this far. You just didn't expect to be caught." Within a month, news of what happened had spread through our social circles. The teachers at school, who had once admired Madison's apparent commitment during our engagement, now understood why she'd seemed so distant at school events. My friends, who had thought Madison was merely reserved, realized they'd witnessed calculated emotional manipulation. Madison's reputation in the school district took a significant hit. Parents began requesting that their children's cases be assigned to other social workers. Her supervisor quietly suggested she might be better suited to a different department, one with less direct family interaction. 6 months later, I heard Madison had relocated to Illinois. She'd left Kansas City entirely, unable to restore her professional credibility after the truth about her deceptive tendencies in personal relationships came to light. For me, the ordeal taught me a crucial lesson about the difference between being empathetic and being gullible. I'd mistaken Madison's emotional detachment for depth, her manipulation for thoughtfulness. When I eventually began dating again, I knew to seek someone who could be transparent about their desires in a relationship. Madison had wanted security without commitment, partnership without closeness, marriage without love. Instead, she received a public lesson that fraud carries consequences, even in matters of the heart. Sometimes the most critical lesson isn't about love, it's about truth.